York under the Vikings, England's northern capital. Walk through the streets of York today, and you're in one of England's most visited historic cities. York Minster's Gothic towers dominate the skyline. Medieval city walls encircle the ancient center. The shambles of preserved medieval street draws millions of tourists every year, photographing its overhanging timber buildings. But rewind just over 1,000 years, to the year 950 AD, and walk these same streets, and you wouldn't be in England at all. You'd be in Jorvik, capital of a Viking kingdom that controlled northern England. The language in the streets would be Old Norse, not English. The king ruling from here wouldn't be English, he'd be a Norwegian Viking named Eric Bloodaxe. The city walls would be the same Roman fortifications that had stood for centuries, but the people living within them would be Norse warriors, Scandinavian settlers, and a mixed population of Anglo-Saxons adapting to life under Viking rule. This is York under the Vikings, when England's northern capital was the beating heart of a Norse kingdom that terrified Anglo-Saxon England and connected Yorkshire to the vast Viking world stretching from Dublin to Kiev. To understand Viking York, you must first understand what the city had been and how it fell. York began as Eboracum, Roman legionary fortress founded in 71 AD. It became one of Roman Britain's most important cities. The Emperor Constantine was proclaimed here in 306 AD. After the Romans withdrew from Britain around 410 AD, the city continued under British and then Anglo-Saxon control. By the early 9th century, York, now called Eoforwic by the Anglo-Saxons, was the capital of the Kingdom of Northumbria, one of the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. It was a major ecclesiastical center with an archbishop, schools, and libraries. The Northumbrian scholar Alcuin, who served at Charlemagne's court, came from York's cathedral school. But in 866 AD, everything changed. A Viking army called the Great Heathen Army, led by the legendary sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, and Halfdan Ragnarsson, captured York. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the Vikings took York and established themselves there. The city's name changed from Eoforwic to Jorvik, the Norse pronunciation. From 866 to 954, at nearly 90 years, York was under Viking control, though this control was interrupted by periods of Anglo-Saxon reconquest. The Vikings established the Kingdom of Jorvik, sometimes independent, sometimes allied with Viking Dublin, always a major power in northern England. By 950 AD, York was ruled by Eric Bloodaxe, the last independent Viking king of Jorvik. Eric, son of Harald Fairhair of Norway, had been expelled from Norway and found a kingdom in York. His rule was turbulent and would end in 954 AD, when he was killed, and York permanently returned to English control. But in 950 AD, Viking York was still a living reality, a Norse city in the heart of England. York in 950 AD occupied the same strategic position as modern York at the confluence of the River Ouse and the River Foss in northern England. The city was built on the site of the old Roman fortress, and the Roman walls still defined its boundaries. These stone walls, built in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, enclosed roughly 50 acres on the northeast bank of the Ouse. The walls stood approximately 6 meters high, constructed of limestone, with defensive towers at intervals and gates providing controlled access. The River Ouse was the city's lifeline. It was navigable by Viking longships and cargo vessels, connecting York to the North Sea via the Humber estuary. This river access made York a natural trading hub, allowing goods from Scandinavia, the Baltic, and continental Europe to flow into northern England. Within the walls, the urban layout still followed the Roman street grid to some extent. The two main Roman roads, the Via Principalis running roughly east-west, and the Via Praetoria running north-south, remained the primary thoroughfares. These intersected at the old Roman headquarters building site, which by 950 AD was the location of important Viking-era structures. Archaeological excavations, particularly the famous Coppergate dig in the 1970s and 1982, have revealed that Viking-age York was densely built. Buildings crowded along narrow streets and lanes. Property boundaries from the Viking period show long, Narrow plots running back from the street frontages, a layout pattern that persisted into medieval times. The Coppergate area, whose name derives from the Old Norse Kopari Gata, meaning street of the cupmakers, was a major artisan and commercial district. Archaeological evidence shows it was lined with workshops and dwellings. The Ouse riverfront was lined with wooden wharves and jetties where ships tied up to load and unload cargo. Warehouses and merchants' premises clustered near the river to handle trade goods. Outside the walls, settlement was limited. Some buildings existed along the roads leading from the city gates, but the majority of the population lived within the Roman walls' protection. The architecture of Viking York was predominantly timber construction, with only a few stone buildings surviving from earlier periods. Most residential and commercial buildings were constructed using post and wattle techniques. Builders dug vertical posts into the ground to form the structural frame, then wove horizontal wattles, thin branches between the posts. This wattle framework was then covered with daub, a mixture of clay, mud, straw, and animal dung, and plastered over. This created relatively sturdy walls that provided insulation and weather protection. Buildings were typically 1 or 2 stories, long and narrow to fit the property plots. Roofs were steeply pitched, covered with thatch straw or reeds or wooden shingles. The steep pitch helped shed rain and snow. Archaeological evidence from Coppergate shows buildings measuring approximately 4 to 5 meters wide and 7 to 10 meters deep. The ground floor often served as a workshop or shop, with living quarters above or at the rear. Floors were packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw. Hearth were central features, typically stone-lined fire pits in the center of the room or against a wall. Smoke escaped through openings in the roof or under the eaves, as proper chimneys were not yet in use. This made interiors smoky and the fire risk constant. The only significant stone buildings in Viking York were remnants of Roman construction and the church buildings. The Minster, the cathedral church, was a stone structure, though not the Gothic cathedral we see today. That wouldn't be built until after the Norman conquest. The extent to which the Vikings maintained Christian churches in York during the early conquest period is debated, but by the mid-10th century, Christianity was re-established, and stone churches existed. Other churches included smaller parish churches serving different districts of the city. These were simple stone structures with wooden roofs, thick walls, and narrow windows. Building materials came from local sources. Timber was sourced from the surrounding forests. Stone came from Roman ruins or local quarries. Clay for daub and pottery was dug from local clay beds. Thatch came from reed beds along the rivers. The population of Viking York at its peak is estimated between 10,000 and 15,000 people, making it one of the largest urban centers in Britain at the time. Only London was clearly larger. The population was ethnically mixed, a combination of Scandinavian settlers, Norwegians, and Danes, Anglo-Saxons who had lived in York before the Viking conquest, and their mixed descendants. Social structure was hierarchical, but different from the feudal system developing elsewhere in England. At the top was the Viking king of Jorvik. In 950 AD, this was Eric Bloodaxe. The king was a military leader, lawgiver, and ultimate authority. Viking kingship was personal and based on military success, loyalty, and the ability to reward followers. Kings held court, dispensed justice, led armies, and received tribute. Below the king were the jarls, Norse earls or nobles who controlled territories, commanded warriors, and owed loyalty to the king. These men were wealthy landowners, often of Scandinavian origin, who formed the military and political elite. The herdmen or huskarls were the king's personal retainers, professional warriors who formed his bodyguard and the core of his military force. These men lived in the king's hall, received food, weapons, and treasure in exchange for their service and loyalty. Free farmers and merchants formed the middle ranks. Norse society had a strong tradition of free landholders, bondi, who owned their farms, bore arms, and participated in assemblies things. In urban York, this class included merchants engaged in trade, master craftsmen who owned workshops, and successful artisans. Craftsmen and laborers formed the working class. Archaeological evidence from Coppergate shows specialized craftsmen, blacksmiths forging iron tools and weapons, leather workers making shoes and belts, woodworkers producing bowls and furniture, textile workers spinning wool and weaving cloth, jewelers crafting brooches and arm rings from bronze and silver, antler and bone workers making combs and pins, and potters producing cooking vessels and storage jars. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were thrall slaves. Viking society accepted slavery, and thralls were acquired through warfare, raiding, and trade. They worked as domestic servants, farm laborers, and in the hardest, most menial jobs. The slave trade was part of Viking York's economy, though the extent is difficult to quantify from archaeological evidence. Women's status in Viking society was higher than in some contemporary cultures. Women could own property, inherit land, divorce husbands, and manage households and businesses when men were absent. In York, women worked in textile production, brewing, food preparation, and likely ran shops and market stalls. Daily life in 950 AD. York daily life in Viking York was governed by work, survival, and the rhythms of trade and craft production. Most people woke at dawn. The day began with rekindling the hearth fire critical for cooking, heating, and light. Breakfast might consist of bread, porridge made from oats or barley, and ale, or milk. The main meal was eaten in the evening and consisted of bread, stews made from vegetables, meat when available, fish, and dairy products. The wealthy ate better, with more meat, imported delicacies, and fine ale or mead. Honey was the primary sweetener. Food was cooked in iron pots over the hearth fire or roasted on spits. Bread was baked in clay ovens or on hot stones. Ale was the common drink for everyone. Water was often unsafe, so weak ale was consumed by adults and children alike. Work consumed most daylight hours. Craftsmen labored in workshops that opened directly onto the street. A blacksmith would work at his forge, hammer striking hot iron. A leather worker would cut and stitch hides into shoes, belts, and scabbards. A woodworker would shape bowls and cups on a lathe. A jeweler would cast bronze brooches and molds and engrave decorative patterns. Archaeological finds from Coppergate include thousands of objects that revealed daily work: iron knives, axes, and tools, leather shoes and offcuts, wooden bowls and spoons, bone and antler combs with decorative carvings, glass and amber beads, pottery vessels, and textile fragments showing weaving patterns. Women managed households, spun wool on spindles, wove cloth on vertical looms, preserved food by salting and smoking, brewed ale, and cared for children. Children worked from a young age, helping parents with tasks appropriate to their age: fetching water, tending animals, learning crafts through apprenticeship. Hygiene was basic by modern standards, but not non-existent. People washed hands and faces in basins. Archaeological evidence shows Vikings used combs. Hundreds have been found in York, indicating concern for grooming. Parasites, lice, intestinal worms were common, as shown by environmental archaeological analysis of cesspit deposits. Sanitation was primitive. Human waste was disposed of in pits and backyards, which were periodically emptied. Refuse was thrown into streets or yards. The smell of a Viking city would have been overwhelming by modern standards. Entertainment included storytelling, dice games, board games like Nephidafel, music from simple instruments, and drinking in alehouses. Religious festivals, both Christian and remnants of Norse pagan celebrations, provided communal gatherings. Trade and economic power. Viking York's wealth came from its position as a major trading hub connecting Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland, and continental Europe. The River Ouse provided access to the North Sea, allowing Viking longships and cargo vessels called nares to sail directly to York. Trade routes extended to Scandinavia, importing furs, timber, amber, walrus ivory, and whetstones, exporting wool, silver, and finished goods. Dublin and Viking Ireland had strong political and commercial ties, trading slaves, silver, and goods. The Rhineland and Low Countries imported wine, pottery, glassware, and metalwork. The Baltic imported amber, furs, and slaves. connecting to eastern trade routes reaching Byzantium and the Islamic world. Archaeological evidence shows York imported pottery from the Rhineland, distinctive Badorf ware, amber from the Baltic, silk from Byzantium or beyond, small silk fragments found, silver coins from Islamic lands, dirhams found in York hoards, soapstone vessels from Scandinavia, lava querns, millstones from the Rhineland, wine and imported pottery vessels. York exported wool and woolen cloth, England's primary export commodity, lead from Pennine mines, iron tools and weapons forged in York, leather goods, jet jewelry from Whitby, silver coins minted in York. York minted its own coins. Viking kings issued silver pennies stamped with their names and titles, struck by moneyers in the city. Coin finds show York pennies circulated widely across Viking Britain and Scandinavia. The presence of a royal mint indicates York's economic sophistication and the king's control over currency. Markets operated in designated areas, likely in open spaces near the Ouse and along major streets. Merchants traded, craftsmen sold their goods, and farmers brought produce. The economy used a mixture of barter and coinage. Silver was also used by weight, with pieces cut from arm rings, ingots, or hacked silver weighed on scales to make transactions. Political power and the Viking king's political authority in Viking York centered on the king, but the system was different from contemporary Anglo-Saxon or Carolingian governance. The king of Jorvik ruled with the support of his warriors and the consent of the free population. Viking political culture included the thing, an assembly where free men gathered to make laws, settle disputes, and elect or acclaim leaders. Eric Bloodaxe, ruling in 950 AD, came from Norwegian royalty. He was the son of Harald Fairhair, who unified Norway, but had been expelled from Norway by his brother. Eric found a kingdom in York, where he ruled approximately 947–948 AD, and again 950–954 AD. His rule was interrupted by periods when the Anglo-Saxon king regained control. Eric faced challenges from the Anglo-Saxon king of England, Eddard, who claimed overlordship of Northumbria. The king's hall was the center of political life, a large timber structure where the king feasted with his warriors, received petitions, dispensed justice, and displayed his wealth and power. Justice was administered according to Viking law, which differed from Anglo-Saxon law. Norse law emphasized compensation for injuries and killings, blood feuds, trial by combat or ordeal, and the importance of honor and reputation. The relationship between the Viking rulers of York and the Christian Church was complex. By the mid-10th century, the Vikings in England had converted to Christianity, or at least tolerated it. The Archbishop of York continued to function, maintaining ecclesiastical authority even under pagan or nominally Christian Viking kings. This was a pragmatic arrangement. Religion: Norse gods and Christian saints. Religion in Viking York was syncretic, a mixture of Christianity and Norse paganism, with the balance shifting over time. The Vikings who conquered York in 866 were pagans, worshipping gods like Odin, Thor, and Freyr. Early Viking rule likely involved destruction or appropriation of Christian churches. But by the mid-10th century, Christianity was firmly re-established. The Minster York's cathedral continued to function under Viking rule. The position of Archbishop of York persisted, maintaining the ecclesiastical hierarchy. In 950 AD, Archbishop Wulfstan held the office. The church provided continuity of administration, literacy, and connection to the wider Christian world. Many Vikings converted to Christianity, sometimes for political reasons, sometimes through genuine belief, and often through gradual cultural assimilation. Conversion was often superficial. Initially, Vikings might be baptized but continue to invoke Thor in battle or wear both crosses and Thor's hammers as amulets. Archaeological evidence shows this religious mixture. Graves from Viking York show both pagan burial practices and Christian practices. Some burials seem to combine elements of both traditions. Norse mythology and Christian theology coexisted in the cultural imagination. Carved stone crosses from Viking Yorkshire show Christian imagery mixed with Norse artistic styles and pagan motifs. Church buildings were stone structures, maintained and used for Christian worship. Services were conducted in Latin, comprehensible to most of the population. Parish churches served different districts of the city, and monasteries may have existed in or near York. Norse pagan practices, where they persisted, were less institutionalized than Christianity. There were no pagan temples in York that we know of. By 950 AD, the cultural trend was toward Christianity. The Viking elite increasingly adopted Christian identity to integrate with Anglo-Saxon society and gain political legitimacy. Eric Bloodaxe himself may have been Christian, at least nominally, though sources are unclear. York's defenses in 950 AD relied on the Roman walls and the military strength of the Viking garrison. The Roman walls, built over 6 centuries earlier, still stood as the primary fortification. These stone walls enclosed the city on 3 sides, with the river Ouse forming a natural barrier on the 4th. Gates at key points controlled access, like the southeastern gate near Fishergate and the southwestern gate, Micklegate. These gates were fortified with wooden towers and heavy gates that could be closed and barred. Guards manned the walls. The military force defending York included the king's herd, his personal retinue of professional warriors. These 100,200 men lived in the king's hall, receiving weapons, armor, and treasure, forming the army's core. The general levy of free men could be called to arms in emergencies. Every free man was expected to fight. This could raise hundreds to over 1,000 additional fighters, though less trained than professional warriors. Ships provided both defense and offensive capability. Viking longships could be beached along the Ouse, ready to deploy for raids or defense. Naval power was central to Viking military strength. Weapons included swords, expensive, high-status weapons owned by wealthy warriors. Iron blades, often pattern-welded for strength, with decorated hilts, were symbols of status. Axes were common weapons, from simple wood-cutting axes to specialized battle axes. Spears were the most common weapon, iron spearheads on wooden shafts, used for thrusting or throwing. Bows and arrows were used in warfare and hunting, while knives and daggers were universally carried. Shields were round wooden shields covered with leather, with an iron boss in the center. Armor was limited to the elite. Chainmail shirts, or burnies, were extremely expensive. Owned only by kings, jarls, and wealthy warriors, most fighters wore leather or padded cloth armor. Helmets were simple iron or leather caps, not the horned helmets of myth, and relied on shields for protection. Military tactics emphasized shield wall formations, warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping. Creating a defensive wall, they engaged in aggressive charges and hand-to-hand combat. They also utilized terrain and fortifications, alongside naval mobility for surprise attacks or rapid movement. Eric Bloodaxe's reign was militarily active. He fought against the Anglo-Saxon king Eddard. Eddard launched campaigns into Northumbria, attempting to assert control over the region. Eric was ultimately killed in 954 AD at the Battle of Stainmore, fighting against Eadred's forces. His death marked the end of independent Viking rule in York. Viking York in 950 AD was a thriving Norse city, a political capital, trading hub, and cultural crossroads, where Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon worlds met and merged, creating a unique cultural blend. The city Eric Bloodaxe ruled bore little resemblance to the Gothic splendor of modern York. There was no York Minster with its magnificent medieval stonework that would be built centuries later. The shambles did not exist in its current medieval form. The Viking city was smaller, dirtier, more dangerous. Built of timber and thatch rather than stone and tile, was a raw, bustling settlement. But Viking York was not a barbaric backwater. Archaeological evidence reveals a sophisticated urban economy, international trade connections, skilled craftsmen producing high-quality goods, and a mixed population, adapting to cultural change, and a political system that created stability and prosperity for nearly a century. Eric Bloodaxe's death in 954 ended Viking rule. York returned to Anglo-Saxon and then Norman control, but the Viking legacy persisted in street names derived from Norse, like any name ending in gate, in the genetic heritage of Yorkshire's population, in artistic styles blending Norse and English traditions, and in the archaeological layers beneath modern York streets. A hidden history. The Jorvik Viking Center, built on the Coppergate excavation site, allows modern visitors to experience a reconstruction of Viking York based on archaeological evidence, bringing history to life. But the real Viking city, smoky, smelly, violent, vibrant, and strange, existed for nearly 90 years. As a Norse capital in the heart of England, a powerful and influential hub, standing in modern York, surrounded by medieval architecture and tourist crowds, requires imagination. To see the timber buildings, hear Old Norse spoken, smell the tanneries and smoke, and picture Viking warriors walking where tourists now photograph, bridging past and present. Jorvik, under Eric Bloodaxe, was England's northern capital when England itself was divided. A time when the North spoke Norse and worshipped both Christ and Thor. When silver from Baghdad circulated in Yorkshire markets, showcasing vast trade networks. The boundary between English and Scandinavian was a constantly shifting frontier of war, trade, and cultural exchange. The transformation from Jorvik to York was not sudden. It took generations of cultural blending, political reconquest, and gradual Anglicization shaped the city's identity. But the Viking chapter of York's history was the crucible in which much of northern England's identity was forged.